Bonjour, je suis Jacques Fauteux. Je suis le statisticien en chef adjoint du secteur de l'engagement stratégique et champion des langues officielles à StatsCan. J'ai aussi l'honneur d'être membre du conseil d'administration du réseau canadien des centres de recherche. Il me fait vraiment plaisir, au nom du RCCDR et de StatsCan, de souhaiter la bienvenue à tous nos participants, canadiens et internationaux. Nous sommes très heureux que vous soyez des nôtres et pour cette conférence virtuelle du RCCDR, présentée en partenariat avec l'agence pour laquelle je travaille. Avant de vous présenter les conférenciers, permettez-moi de vous offrir quelques mots en guise de reconnaissance des 20 ans de partenariat entre Statistique Canada et le réseau. We've come a really long ways in 20 years. I recall the words from Anil Arora, our chief statistician, earlier this conference, where he says only 5 longitudinal data sets were available to researchers when he was working at the inception of the RDCs. At the time, it was a challenge to get aggregate data from the census into the RDCs. Since then, the collaboration and innovation is part of our has demonstrated incredible growth, and it shows that it's part of our DNA. Since 2000, the network has grown rapidly, providing the research community with access to the data they need to address this country's vital research questions and public policy issues. Because of this work, Canadians now know far more about our society than would have been possible otherwise. Just imagine, we are now serving 2,000 researchers from over 25 disciplines, providing secure access to 1,500 data sets and training more than 400 researchers a year. And in the case of COVID, the research is being done also to help provide hope to businesses, to Canadians that need good evidence-based research to address the challenge of this pandemic. And our partnership keeps evolving, modernizing, and growing. And this conference is an example of how we were able to adapt to the circumstances and deliver to you, our members and researchers, the value of data and share our experiences to move forward in the future and help Canadians make our country stronger. And as my chief statistician said before at the aim of the conference, we will keep on growing. And we intend to do so with the virtual data labs. And our aim, as he said, is to grow access 100-fold. Today's series addresses cross-cutting research and priorities related to ethnic and racial issues. I'm very pleased to welcome 4 panelists who will share their experience on how the CRDCN is advancing their research and informing policy as it relates to issues that are very much at the forefront, both in Canada and internationally. This will discuss the role of the CRDCN enabling policy-related analysis on key cultural, social, and health issues in the pursuit of a just, equitable, and inclusive Canada. They will share their aspirations for future data, research and policy development related to ethnic and racial issues. Cette partie du panel avait été préenregistrée. Nous vous inviterons à poser vos questions en écoutant chaque orateur. Nous en parlerons autant que possible dans les questions et réponses en direct qui suivront. J'invite maintenant Michael Hahn, professeur agrégé et directeur académique du Centre de données de recherche de l'Université Western, à lancer le panel d'aujourd'hui. Les intérêts de recherche de Michael recoupent les domaines de la démographie, de l'établissement des immigrants, de l'intégration au marché du travail et du développement des données. Michael is widely consulted by provincial and federal governments for policy advice in the areas of immigration, settlement services, the Canadian labor market, and population aging. Michael, over to you.
Great. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. As Jacques mentioned, my name is Michael Hahn. I've been a long-time RDC user, and I am very pleased to be part of this panel because the RDC really has changed the types of research that I can do. One of the things that's really changed my life was how it compressed the geography of Canada in terms of access to data. So just as a brief biographical note, in 2002, as I was starting to begin work on my dissertation, I moved to Ottawa to work in the Business and Labour Market Analysis Division at Statistics Canada on my dissertation topic of immigration and housing. Now, the reason I had to move to Ottawa was that census master files, which was and probably is the best source of data for housing, wasn't in the RDCs yet. So it was necessary to actually physically move to Ottawa and work in the Statistics Canada headquarters, and I ended up living there for 3 years. Now, over the 3 years that I did live, while I did live in Ottawa, the RDCs did receive census data. So when I was completing my dissertation and I was looking for academic employment, I was able to consider quite a few different geographical destinations because my primary data set was already located there. So initially I moved to Edmonton first to assume a position at the University of Alberta. And then I went to Fredericton to work at the University of New Brunswick, and now here I am at Western. To be honest, I can't imagine that I would have been able to, that I would have moved, that I would have left Ottawa, had the files, the census files, and all the data that follow it, had they not made it into the RDC. So that to me is really exciting because it reduces the geographical discrimination that arguably used to exist for quantitative researchers in Canada. So one of the things that's continued, and it's not just as though the RDC has changed things. I believe that the RDC is going to continue to change things. I'm the academic director of Western's RDC, so I'm fortunate enough to sit in on the academic directors meetings. And what we keep hearing about new data access options, pathways to extended hours, better processing strategies than what currently exists. And I think all of these things are going to make the CRDCN even better. So my final thing about how the RDC has changed things is that it allows universities from across Canada, especially those with RDCs, to recruit better quality faculty. So now a university in any corner of Canada can actually have can be competitive in some ways in terms of recruiting because the same data sets are accessible across the country. It also helps us increase the quality of our publications, which is obviously a plus for Canadian researchers. So the RDC not only changed my research agenda, I believe it is increasingly shaping it. I started off working with census master files, but since then I've moved into work with some of the very exciting administrative data files, particularly the IMDb and the LAD and some of the linkages that exist between those files. And that has been really fascinating for me. So not only has the RDC changed my research, but it's continuing to change my research because I find myself struggling, and I mean this in a good way, struggling at times to keep up with the dizzying pace at which data sets are being released by Statistics Canada. So to some extent, I find my research agenda sort of steering and meandering a little bit based on the files that StatCan sends to us in the RDC. So in terms of what I'm doing now for my future research, I've kind of come full circle. So I studied housing during my dissertation and grew kind of tired of the topic for a while and moved on to study migration, immigration, labor market integration, etc. But now, with the Trudeau government announcing the implementation of the National Housing Strategy, which is a 10-year, $55 billion plan, I find myself drawn back to housing. This is being compounded by the fact that the National Housing Statistics Program is currently in the RDC on a pilot basis, and will likely, the rest of all Canadian researchers, will likely gain access to these data fairly soon. So I'm going to go back into housing and start to look at how the housing market differs, whether there's unequal access for people of different immigrant or racialized category groupings. And finally, I would be remiss not to talk about COVID in 2020. So one of my future research streams is going to be looking at how COVID has steered housing demand or shifted housing demand. I mean, an obvious response could be that people now, since they've been cooped up for so long, are more likely to seek larger houses with bigger backyards, which would suggest that condo markets might start to decline, or townhouses, etc. But the research that I've seen so far suggests that this is far from the case. Toronto continues to set housing price records, suggesting that demand is as strong as it ever has been. And one of the things that I want to do in the future is look at how COVID has shaped housing demand, if it has at all. So thank you for listening. I think I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Michael. I really like the insights that you brought on the IMDb files, particularly the dizzying pace of the release of data and how it impacted your work. The fact also that you moved to Ottawa and your perspective on how the RDCs have removed the geographical discrimination has really gave me another perspective. So I'm sure that those in attendance cannot imagine having quantitative data at their fingertips without the RDC network. So at this particular point, we will proceed with Rupa, who is an associate professor of human resource management and organizational behavior at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. Rupa examines the employment experiences of immigrants and racialized Canadians, both from the perspective of highly skilled immigrants and temporary foreign workers. She's motivated to understand the factors that pose barriers for immigrants and the potential avenues to overcome their disadvantage. My pleasure to introduce you, Rupa Banerjee.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my, I guess, personal experience using the RDCs to access ethno-racial data. So for me, the impact of the research data centers really started when I began my doctoral research in about 2003. So in many ways, I would say the RDCs, in fact, raised me as a researcher. In fact, an entire generations of researchers around me have really had the opportunity to develop their passion and hone their skills because of the easy accessibility of the RDCs. I mean, I don't think that I would have become a quantitative researcher if it wasn't for the RDC program. For me, even the process of accessing the data was extremely instructive when I was a novice researcher, because in some ways it vetted whether a research idea was doable with the particular data set that I thought it might be doable with. So in those days when I was a PhD student, I was so excited about the different possibilities to investigate fascinating questions. And I actually designed my research training around the data availability within the RDCs. So those were the days when the LSIC, the Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, had recently come out. And I found out that this was a wonderful longitudinal data set. So I made sure that I took courses on longitudinal methodologies like growth curve modeling or survival analysis to really be able to exploit this wonderful data. So for my PhD dissertation back then, I used 3 different StatsCan data sets. I used the LSIC, the SLID, the Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics, and I used the EDS, which was also very new and fresh at that time. And I used those data sets to examine employment experiences of racialized immigrants from various angles. So the availability of these 3 data sets at that time was absolutely invaluable for me to be able to approach my research questions in a robust and fulsome way. Each of the data sets provided rich and complementary information that really wasn't available anywhere else. So to my knowledge, the LSIC, for example, was the first large-scale Canadian survey to provide such detailed metrics of settlement and integration of immigrants over time. And the fact that it contained pre-migration and post-migration variables and detailed information about ethno-racial characteristics, family composition, social capital, human capital investments, really meant that researchers like me could investigate the actual mechanisms that were driving integration or lack thereof. So Statistics Canada data really allowed me to investigate both objective and subjective experiences of discrimination and inequality, and expand beyond the traditional outcome variables like income or employment. I was able to examine experiences of belonging and feelings of trust in addition to income and employment. I was able to look at perceptions of discrimination, participation in community organizations, membership in unions and occupational licensing bodies. So for researchers of ethno-racial discrimination or ethno-racial diversity, one of the key limitations is often small sample sizes. So the oversampling of ethno-racial minorities in various StatsCan data sets like the EDS or the GSS, General Social Survey, has really been instrumental in allowing us to really do deep dives into the experiences of individual minority groups across generations as well. So these data sets have been critical, not only for studying the experiences of various ethno-racial groups, but also for examining religious diversity, for example. In the EDS, there was detailed religious affiliation categories, as well as questions about religious observance. And since the census only asked about religion every other cycle, the EDS provided a very useful source of data on this crucial issue. So I would say going forward, over the past, over 15 years, I have absolutely enjoyed using a variety of data sets to explore issues of immigration and ethno-racial diversity from a variety of angles. And going forward, I'm so excited about the linked data sets that have recently been made available and are also currently in development. So for example, I have been working with the LSIC IMDb, which provides amazing opportunity to continue to actually use the rich LSIC data set so that it doesn't, become stale, because the actual original data is quite old now. So on top of that, I think the addition of the visible minority categories to the labor force survey, which has been announced, will also allow for detailed analysis of race and labor market outcomes. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. I mean, I would even advocate for even more ethno-racial categories to be included within the LFS, because it would allow for a more detailed examination of the way that ethnicity plays into labor market outcomes. So I would also advocate for a new EDS. I mean, it's been almost 20 years since the survey was undertaken, and it's long overdue, especially with the current climate, the social climate of today. So lastly, I would love to see more longitudinal sources of data to allow us to really examine the trajectories of ethno-racial minorities over time. So I hope I've given you a little bit of my perspective in terms of my use of RDC data and the reason why I'm so excited to continue using it into the future.
Rupa, thank you very much for your words. I found that where I really related is and I'm happy to hear, is how the RDCs impacted your career at the onset, but also how it's doing it now, particularly with the data sets, and how it's guiding some of your research, and how it's influencing not only you, but how you're hoping to influence other researchers and PhD students and take the path that you did by having more rich data and linked data. Thank you very much. Next, we'll go through Abdi Ketimipour, Professor of Sociology and Chair of Ethnic Studies and Academic Director of the Prairie Regional Research Data Center at the University of Calgary. Abdi was the founding Academic Director of the RDC at Lethbridge and Memorial Universities. His research is on socioeconomic experiences of immigrants in Canada and the sociocultural developments of the Middle East, the results of which are published in both English and Persian. Without any further ado, Abdi, over to you.
Thank you, Jacques, and hello, everyone. I can definitely echo a lot of the observations and comments that both Mike and Rupa made in terms of the impact of the RDC initiative on the personal career and on my research program. But I would like to use the few minutes that I have here to highlight something that goes beyond my own research program and talk about the sort of the larger and the broader implications of the RDC initiative. I can think of three major contributions that the RDC initiative has made to research and thinking and policy making in Canada. One is that through the possibility of disaggregating data at a much more detailed, much more refined way, I think we have been able to give more visibility to some minority voices and minority experiences. As you know, in a lot of cases, a lot of the smaller groups are lumped together when we are structuring the data, and they are given a very sort of broad label, and in many cases those labels are others or not included elsewhere, which don't have any kind of substantive meaning. And through that kind of practice, basically the experiences of those minorities disappear from the scene and from the conversations that are happening. And I think the RDC data has allowed us to get into the specific experiences of those minorities without sort of putting them into this kind of blank categories. And in the current environment, with all the sensitivity and attention to the minority experiences, and rightfully so, I think this is a very crucial and important contribution. The second area that I think the RDC initiative has contributed to is that it has allowed for, again, through the kind of disaggregation that is possible under the RDC guidelines, I think it has allowed for certain problems to be captured much more effectively. When we are dealing with broad categories, a lot of times the different experiences that are happening beyond those broad categories cancel each other out. And in many cases, they give us the appearance of no problem. And I think the RDC has allowed us to get a higher resolution thinking around a lot of social problems and social issues. And through that, I think it has contributed to the policy debates and thinking about policy interventions. One classic example of this is the case of visible minorities in Canada, and the use of categories like visible minority, non-visible minority. I think it masks a lot of diversity that is happening beyond and behind all these categories. In the case of non-visible minorities, there are lots of groups that and visible minorities, there are lots of groups that have very different experiences, and a lot of time, if we use an average of all those experiences, they basically cancel each other out, and we don't see a problem there. And I think the RDC data has allowed me to get a much more refined picture with regard to those social problems and discover problems that otherwise we could not capture. The third area that I think also RDC has made a significant contribution is more of a contribution to the social science disciplines. The first two contributions that I mentioned, they are mostly contributions to the popular debates and the policy debates. But I think in this area, by highlighting the significance and the importance of quantitative research methods, it has also contributed to the social science research and to creating a more balanced posture for social science disciplines. As many of you may know, there has been an unfortunate trend over the past couple of decades in various social science disciplines to undermine the quantitative methods and to give more significance to the qualitative methods. As a mixed method researcher myself, I see a place for each of those methods in my sort of methodological toolbox. And I think by reducing the significance of any one of them, we basically deprive ourselves of the ability to tackle certain issues that can be captured only through a very specific methodology. And the undermining of the quantitative methods over the past couple of decades has basically deprived us from examining and studying some of the macro level issues that are out there, and has sort of shifted our attention to the problems that are more micro or meso at those levels. And I think the RDC initiative has shown that through the investment of time and energy and money into creating the RDCs has shown that this kind of method and this kind of data is significant enough to justify that kind of investment. So I think through that, it will create a more balanced posture, methodological posture in social sciences. So these are the three main areas that I think RDC has contributed to the current thinking. And for the future, I think I'm hoping that there will be more possibilities for some kind of international comparative research using the RDC data that current restrictions do not allow for that very easily, and also more longitudinal data that my colleagues mentioned. So that's all the comments that I have at the moment.
Thank you, MD. Particularly for your insights on how the RDCs and particularly the data has helped to level the playing field for minority groups and for how that helps public policy discussions to bring new perspectives that enables those decisions to make our society stronger and better. Next, we move to my public service colleague, Umit Kizikhan, le dirigeant principal des données à Immigration, Réfugiés, Citoyenneté Canada. Umit est un ancien membre du conseil d'administration du RCCDR et un grand champion du réseau. Il est actuellement préoccupé par la fragilité croissante des démocraties libérales qui alimentent son engagement envers des données de qualité et informations fiables pour éclairer les politiques publiques et les récits factuels. Umit est un grand champion des réseaux que nous avons en place et un grand ami de StatsCan. J'invite Umit à prendre la parole.
Good afternoon, bon après-midi. I will speak to you today about how our administrative data, that is Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, IRCC, has been mobilized in support of policy-relevant research on the socioeconomic conditions of newcomers and visible minority and ethnic communities in Canada. My story is one of data transformation and liberation, ultimately providing ready and secure access to disaggregated data to researchers across Canada. From the start, our vision has been to have more eyes on more quality data in secure environments. Before we begin, a quick observation to put this data transformation and liberation story in the context of this particular panel. As you know, intersectionality has become an increasingly critical analytical lens, one that refers usually to race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, age, as not mutually exclusive entities, but rather as reciprocally interacting and constructing factors. However, given global migration trends, immigration status has also become a key component of such intersectionality. If you also consider the increasing percentage of newcomers being from non-European countries to Canada, the essential nature of immigration data in the study of ethnicity and race becomes even clearer. So let's start from the beginning, the operational data. At IRCC, historically, the main source of data has been administrative. Admin data has been collected and used primarily, if not exclusively, for operational decision-making. Simply put, to process applications by permanent and temporary residents. This data contains crucial socio-demographic client information, as you could anticipate: birth date, birthplace, citizenship, family formation, official languages, education, etc. However, as you would also anticipate, this admin data by its nature has a lot of issues and noise, such as missing data and whatnot. So therefore, naturally, given our interest in admin data, beyond its immediate use, we had to do something. So the admin data had to be further transformed and developed. We had to access it first, and don't take this step for granted, especially in complex federal departments, if you know what I mean, and then clean it. We had to clean it, establish standards, imputing missing values, removing duplicates, etc. But one of the key essential transformations we did was to transform this data from document-based, application document-based and decision to person-based data. We were then able to create in-house client continuums where we could relate and track data and individuals as their status changed from student to temporary foreign worker, refugee claimant, permanent resident, citizen. How did we use this transformed person-based data? The first use was by setting up statistical reporting capacity. And some of you might remember Facts and Figures, our flagship publication at the time, and that served us really well. However, the major step in our data transformation came with external data linkages. And this is where enters Statistics Canada. With their expertise, commitment to research data, and especially their world-renowned management controls to establish a secure data linkage and development environment, StatsCan was the ideal partner. Our first flagship database was IMDb. Many of you are familiar with it, the longitudinal immigration database. We started back in early 2000s, linking Canadian revenue agencies, tax filers' data with our permanent residence files, capturing at individual and later on family level, information such as earnings, employment insurance, social assistance, enabling comparative and longitudinal analysis by source country, immigration category, and whatnot. Fast forward, in the last 7 years, we have expanded the IMDb to include 12 million immigrants who landed in Canada between 1952 and 2018, almost a near census of this population. And now IMDb includes not just permanent residents, but also temporary residents, citizenship update, express entry, Syrian refugees program, and most recently also the settlement services data. After IMDb, we turned our attention to survey data linkages. And there's a wealth of information here, of course, for research purposes. We piloted a linkage with the 2011 census, and then the admission category and then we added the admission category onto the 2016 census, of course with StatsCan help all the time, which provided detailed information on demographic and ethnocultural characteristics and socioeconomic outcomes of immigrants. We then moved on to other key surveys for new linkages: Canadian Community Health Survey, General Social Survey, GSS, Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, LSIC. Even we linked with LSIC, which was done almost 10, 15 years ago. And recently, Labor Force Survey, where a feasibility study is in progress for a linkage. But this is not the most interesting part of the story yet. As we all know, the above-mentioned quality and highly policy-relevant data, if it were to be left, if I may say, to its natural historical destiny, it would not have become available to researchers external to the public service, researchers like yourselves. For example, IMDb remained, as we all know, accessible only to IRCC and StatsCan staff since its inception for almost 2 decades, until about 2 years ago. Therefore, in the spirit of open government, we moved ahead to make our data widely available. Starting in about 2014, we began to invest talent and money in-house and through StatsCan to make available at research data centers across Canada our permanent resident and temporary resident, and then the entire linked immigration data sets. It's important to acknowledge we owe big to many people who have contributed to this effort. People like Ima Okani at IRCC, Jane Barrett, Mark Lachance, Laurent Martel, and especially Scott McLeish, who have convinced us about the long-term value for money of placing our data in RDCs. Then we started our close partnership with CRDCN, Canadian Research Centers Network. With the support of CRDCN and StatsCan, we have since largely accomplished our initial objectives in this data liberation phase of our Infinite project. All our data has already been or about to be placed in RDCs. There are 2 incomplete components. One is the settlement services data. We are running a pilot with StatsCan on this and CRDCN, about 14 researchers working on the data already. And there is also the Canadian Employer-Employee Dynamic Database, which provides comprehensive information on at firm and enterprise employee levels. And it's called CEED, C-E-E-D-D, and has been already linked with IRCC's permanent resident and temporary resident database, but not released to RDCs yet. Researchers like Garnett at IRCC and Garnett Picot at IRCC and Feng Hu at StatsCan have been using it with great results, and the partial release is in progress. Partial release of this database. Donc, en conclusion, alors, c'est quoi les leçons apprises? Premièrement, pour des politiques intelligentes, nous avons besoin de données ventilées sur tous les déterminants sociaux des résultats économiques des populations, surtout les plus vulnérables. Deuxièmement, les données administratives peuvent être une source fiable, mais seulement si nous planifions à l'avance et établissons des partenariats avec les bons partenaires. Troisièmement, de plus, ces données et leurs dérivés liés et enrichis doivent être facilement accessibles aux chercheurs de tous les pays, y compris aux étudiants, nos scientifiques futurs. Aussi à noter, une telle solution mobilise également le courage des jeunes générations à prendre des risques pour poser des questions, je dirais, beaucoup plus difficiles que nous, les bureaucrates ou même les universitaires expérimentés, souvent évitent. Alors, avant que je l'oublie et pour terminer, il existe bien sûr des douzaines d'études publiées et en cours par des chercheurs canadiens établis et émergents qui ont accédé aux données d'IRCC mentionnées dans les centres de données de recherche. D'autres ont également utilisé nos données couplées dans des instituts provinciaux, Ontario, Colombie-Britannique, Nouvelle-Brunswick et Manitoba. Comme le dernier rapport d'Astrid Goodman, peut-être vous l'avez vu, sur le COVID-19 et les immigrants et réfugiés en Ontario, en utilisant nos données couplées avec les données provinciales. Alors, dernièrement, une liste de ces études peut être obtenue, bien sûr, auprès de nos bureaux. Et moi, j'aimerais vous remercier infiniment pour le temps que vous m'avez accordé. Merci.
Merci, Umit, pour ta présentation et nous avoir permis de mieux comprendre comment ton équipe a transformé les données administratives de votre ministère et comment cela a contribué au travail de notre gouvernement actuel et ceux du passé. J'étais fort intéressé de noter que c'était un travail d'équipe. As they say in English, data is a team sport. Et qui s'est fait avec l'aide des collègues de la famille fédérale, avec nos experts de méthodologie de StatsCan, ainsi que nos homologues de l'Agence du revenu. And the bottom line is that the contribution that your colleagues have done is helping, or other colleagues and folks that have spoken prior to you, to advance research for the benefit of all Canadians. This concludes the pre-recorded portion of the Spotlight on Ethnic and Racial Issues. We invite you to please stand by as we transition to the live Q&A session with our panelists. If you have not yet done so, please submit your questions. Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour à tous et je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette deuxième partie de Spotlight on Ethnic and Racial Issues. My name is Gabrielle Baudouin. I'm Director General of Communications of Data Dissemination at Statistics Canada. And I'm here, I'm sitting in for my colleague Jacques Fauteux, who had to participate in World Statistics Day today. He's hosting a session, so unfortunately he couldn't be with us. But we're pleased to have all of these 100 participants online with us today and to listen to your questions. I'd like to also thank our panelists to be live with us right now, and they're eager to listen to these questions. So I'll start with the first question. This one would be for Michael, Rupa, and Abdi. So could each of you share one of the most significant research findings from your own work using RDC data to understand ethnic and racial issues? Maybe starting with Michael. Oh, yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the question. Interesting. One of the things that I use the IMDb to study quite extensively is the recruitment and retention of newcomers to various jurisdictions. So when I lived in New Brunswick, I was looking at New Brunswick. And one of the things that really jumped out for me is that a very strong predictor of retention is the presence of children. And, you know, once you walk through the narrative, you can kind of understand why that would be the case. You know, your kids are social integrative mechanisms. They help you generate social capital. You bring your kids to the arena, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what that ends up doing is it creates opportunities for newcomers to integrate into their host society. And what I found was that this dramatically increased the retention rates. So I thought that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Very interesting. Rupa, over to you.
Yeah, I could think of several, but I think I'll focus on a study that was published a few years ago, specifically looking at gender equity in terms of labor market participation of religious minorities. And so we used census data as well as the ethnic diversity survey data to look at whether the newer religious groups in Canada and the religious minorities in Canada, whether there was more gender inequity, whether women were less likely to participate in the labor market. And what we actually found is that by the second generation, so those born in Canada, there was very little difference among various religious minorities in terms of gender inequity. So that kind of really went against a lot of the prevailing sort of bias that exists in society of some of the religious minorities, particularly among Muslims, and the gender inequity within Muslim minorities. So what we found is that for those born in Canada, whether you were Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or didn't identify as a religious group, there was not much difference in terms of gender inequity of labor participation by the second generation. So that was a very interesting finding.
Thank you, Rupa, and we love your background. Abdi, over to you.
Yes, mine is somewhat related to what Rupa mentioned. As I mentioned in my comments, the RDC data allowed us to identify the sort of specific experiences of some minority groups. And in the case of my research, the minority group that I focused on in my most recent projects was the Muslim immigrants in Canada. And up to that point, most of the studies that existed, there were lots of research about Muslim immigrants, but they were mostly based on discourse analysis of the media contents, of the policy debates, and there was not sort of a hard factual information on the actual experiences on the ground in day-to-day experiences of these immigrants. And so by using the RDC data, I was able to capture the economic experiences of these immigrants and also the social experiences, their experiences in the community, their interaction with the broader society. And I think those added, at least for me, some very significant elements to the picture that they had, and showed in a much more refined way the areas that need attention and need some kind of intervention. So that's the one that I can highlight.
Thank you, Abdi. A very important topic indeed. Thank you. We have a question now from someone that many of us know, Jane Bedetz. She was highly involved throughout her career in social statistics, former from ACS from StatsCan. So she has a question for UMIT and others. Hi, Jane. The COVID pandemic has revealed inequitable access and impacts on ethno-minority populations and the need for disaggregated racial data to better understand the situation of minority groups in Canada. In this context, should StatsCan and the CRDCN promote national standards on how to collect racial data, including the use of terminology such as the term visible minority? UMIT.
I guess in a nutshell, yes. I mean, who is against standards? Of course, in a multi-jurisdictional geography space, this may cause problems and have challenges. That's a given. But one will need to weigh pros and cons. So standards in terms of ranging from the very type of question one asks, how that information collected results into data fields, and how those data fields are later on managed, and of course any interoperability between jurisdictions is established, and how this whole data is later on accessed equitably by all involved and concerned. So those are all the kind of conditionalities of, if you will, behind my answer. Yes, definitely. In the absence of what Jane is asking, whether it should be done or not, everybody is trying to manage something, right? StatsCan is trying to do their own best with what they can. I expressed in my little presentation what we have tried to do in terms of linking our data with Ontario data and in the case of Ontario especially, research already is able to look at the health conditions and COVID impact on racialized and immigrant status individuals. So that's working, but that's just Ontario. So Jane is absolutely onto something, and it'll take a lot of strong will and collaboration across jurisdictions to make something like that happen, if I may add.
And it would help for consistency and concepts and using data from others as well. So Abdi, would you like to answer this?
Yes, I just want to attest that this is a conversation that is actually happening now, and I'm part of an advisory council at the StatsCan along with Rupa and Mike, in which we are actually discussing this very specific issue of visible minorities and other ethno-racial variables. And there are, of course, challenges, and these challenges are something that I personally did not appreciate before joining this the initiative and this conversation. And some of this is that when we change these categories, and of course they have to change according to the new realities and new facts, there is an issue of continuity with the previous research that has been done. So we have to sort of keep a balance between these two important aspects. The other one is that every time that you want, or StatsCan wants to go into more detailed categorization of these attributes, there is still a suspicion out there in the broader society about when a government is in the business of data collection, and there is some sort of reluctance about how much detail should be shared with those data gathering agencies. So those are the kind of conflicting forces that are operating at the moment, and the StatsCan, empathize with the kind of difficult task that they have in terms of balancing all these conflicting forces.
Thank you. Yes, it's a complicated, there are many things at play and many issues, many forces at play, many conflicting priorities, but it's always fun to work in all of those. That's why we're here. Maybe Rupa, do you want to answer on that, and then we will move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think you know, Abdi absolutely covered the important points, which is, first of all, that this is something that is being considered. So I think that's the one point I wanted to make, and I wanted to highlight, you know, the diversity of voices that are on that advisory committee really speaks to the inclusivity of the different kinds of perspectives that are being considered. And so I think I really appreciate that. And then also, it's very true that it's a much more complicated issue than simply saying, yes, that we should certainly be trying to increase data disaggregation. You know, there's so many kind of conflicting and back and forth issues at play here. And so many of us will express one view with full conviction, and then we have you know, another set of experts who have a very different perspective, and for very good reason, on the same kind of question. So we have to consider the fact that this is not a simple yes or no answer, I guess.
So true. Thank you, Rupa. I have another question, which is from, it's about the question is, in what ways should survey and administrative data be enhanced to support more detailed analyses of relationships between ethnic, racial factors and social and health inequalities? So this would be a good question for Abdi and then Rupa.
I think one shortcoming that I see at the moment is not about the contents of the surveys or the data that is there, but the speed at which it becomes available to the sort of research community. And I think if we can improve things on that front, then we can tackle the issues when they are happening. And so at the moment, as many of the audience know, that there is a sort of a lag here, and it will take a couple of years at least to provide access to the data and to make the data sort of workable. So I think that is one area that can be sort of made better. In terms of the content, I guess that's an ongoing conversation, and the fact is that there needs to be openness on all sides to engage in that conversation. And I can see that over the past couple of decades, there has been an increasing level of engagement and openness on all parties involved. So I think we are on the right track.
I just wanted to add here that, and I think Abdi may have mentioned this in his initial presentation there. One thing that I think would be really beneficial is international comparability of the data that we have. It would be great to be able to actually look at the Canadian context in relation to other contexts, and that's one thing that, you know, we are able to do with data from other countries, and I find that that's something that's lacking to some extent in the Canadian data. The other piece is really about remote access. And I know the question really wasn't about how to make access easier, but I think it all plays into the same question, which is how do we actually analyze this data more effectively? And especially given the kind of pandemic times we're living in, it's increasingly important for researchers of various backgrounds to be able to access this rich data, which does exist, from remotely from their own computers. And so I think this is something that is being worked on. I know that it's definitely in the works, but I really want to kind of emphasize how important that is, to be able to actually, you know,
be able to do this research in a more accessible way.
Just to add to what Rupa and Abdi mentioned, I think that one of the reasons we don't know more than what we already do is that there simply aren't enough of us out there looking at these topics. There are over 500 data sets in the RDC, in every RDC across Canada, and to my knowledge, you know, files like the IMDb DAD would allow us to actually answer a lot about health care and healthcare service delivery inequalities. We just don't have enough people working on it yet, and I think collectively we have a responsibility to train more of our younger generation to really become excited about asking and answering these types of questions.
Thank you. Music to my heart. More data users, that's what we need. There's so much of it out there, and especially in this time of COVID, Canada needs more data and more analysis so that we have, you know, answers and guidance. I have a question now, which is for you, Mit, and everyone else. So do you think there's enough data that illustrates the challenges facing new Canadians who are not native English or French speakers? Persons from Eurasia and the Middle East, for example, are not normally listed as visible minorities, but their accents make them clearly audible minority, just like I'm an audible minority, but from Canada. This can have various implications, especially on the labor market. So who wants to take this difficult one? Abdi? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll give it a shot. I mean, absolutely. And there are probably many other dimensions around which there are data limitations. So, but to take the question literally, no, I think that there is not enough data to get at that reality. That is the, you know, life chances or experiences of people who may be marginalized due to their accents. That data doesn't, that type of our administrative data that finds its way to CRDCs doesn't carry that type of those type of definitions. But again, maybe as Abdi was saying at the beginning, there is also a limit to purely quantitative research, and there's a need and space for mixed methodologies. For instance, in IRCC, we do run annual settlement surveys of settlement clients and non-clients. So in the amount of up to 25,000 of each group, every year answer questions. So in those surveys, we do ask several different types of questions in terms of challenges that newcomers are facing. So as we see these type of questions raised and these type of, let's say, new groups identified, then we can integrate those type of questions in this case about accents and newcomer experience, and then try to find out actually what those experiences are like. So there are solutions, but not necessarily all of them may lie today in RDC's 500 so data sets. That's my take on this.
Thank you. Someone else wants to answer this one?
I just want to add a quick point. I agree with everything that Amit mentioned. I think one thing that can add or can enhance our ability in this area is the practice of oversampling, because a lot of these minorities by definition are minorities and therefore they are not represented in the nationwide samples. And at the moment, the oversampling is done on an ad hoc basis, so from time to time based on the available resources. But I think if that becomes a part of the practice in a more sort of routine way, that would sort of give more visibility to these minority issues.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to a next question for Rupa and Michael, and it's asked by Dr. Gustave Goldman, that many of you know, who has been very involved with the development of the CRDCN. He says, I had many conversations with our colleagues internally to learn from their experiences. We're now faced with the conceptual problem that national boundaries should no longer be a limiting factor in demographic research. What is the view of the panelists on opening up the centers to partnerships with other countries? would this advance policy and relevant research in Canada? So Rupa and then Michael.
Absolutely. I think that, as I was mentioning in my previous answer, I think this is really key in terms of not just being able to partner with international partners, but also being able to both learn and teach from our experience. So, for example, a lot of comparative research is done between Canada and Australia in terms of immigration-related research. And if we were able to have partnerships with Australian colleagues, there are data sets in Australia that are very similar to what we have in Canada. And I think that being able to connect in a collaborative way would really benefit both, Canada and kind of global understanding of migration and ethno-racial issues. So I think this is very, very key and important.
Thank you. And Michael?
Yes. Thank you, Gustav. Nice to hear from you virtually. The short answer is yes. Every year at our academic directors meeting, we invite somebody from the U.S. Census Bureau, and they talk about their own research data center program and express an interest in collaborating more closely, and that is shared from the Canadian side as well. Unfortunately, as you can probably appreciate, there are all kinds of legislative and all kinds of hurdles that need to be cleared, but definitely the desire is there. I know Byron was working on it before he departed, and I assume that his successors will continue to work on that. So that's the one side of it. And the other side of it is that I think that by doing these collaborative programs across national boundaries, you can learn more about each of the countries. So I've happened to do a little bit of work comparing immigrant groups in Canada and the United States in the housing markets. And what I found is that even though the housing markets are different, admission policies are different, immigrants more or less behave similarly in both of the housing markets, which I think is really fascinating. So we wouldn't have known that if we weren't able to do this cross-country comparison. And it was a lot of work to set up the data and harmonize variables, etc. So it's not something that should be taken lightly, but it is definitely worth the investment.
Thank you, Michael. We're close to 1 o'clock, but we have so many good questions. We will continue, if you're willing, for another maybe 10-15 minutes. We have a question from Eunice Sengupta, and it would be for Abdi. So the UK Office of National Statistics has been able to link COVID-19 death data to census data, providing findings on BAME groups that were not previously available. Do you think that Statistics Canada can make similar links between COVID-19 death data and census data? Over to you, Abdi.
If I'm not mistaken, I don't work on this particular topic, so I'm not up to date about the recent developments. But I think there has been some initiative in that direction, but I don't know the full extent of what is available or not.
Gabrielle, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. If no one else wants to comment on this one, we'll move on to the next one. Okay. So the next question is, what cautions need to be in place in our research on ethnic and racial issues to avoid stereotyping or even stigmatizing particular social or cultural groups? So Umit, Michael.
Okay, in fact, from the very start, the topic that we are discussing is a very sensitive topic, right? We want more disaggregated data along many dimensions that exist and we are aware. We just discussed a minute ago, accent dimension, and there is more to hope for, wish for, but at the same time, we also are all, I would want to speak for all the panels. In fact, I would have that courage and I'll say, we are all also very sensitive to the fact that the same data, and it was in fact mentioned a few minutes ago, can be used in the wrong hands, but also in its nature in such ways that it can abuse the situation and in fact create a threat to the very groups that in fact the researchers or the policymakers would like to serve and help. So in that respect, number one is obviously the privacy factors, the all the technical considerations that I know that StatsCan, in fact, and we are also very careful in IRCC in terms of not to allow data to identify individuals, very important. And also, obviously, how you frame your research questions. What is it? Because data never speaks in its own, right? We always have a theoretical lens that comes onto the data. We also have political or policy or sometimes even ideological origins to the questions that we send onto the data to make some kind of sense of it. So it's in those framing that one needs to be extra careful. And obviously my academic colleagues, they are talking about these things in class with their emerging researchers and academics. So what I'd say, part of it is in the data, how we manage it to protect the identification of individuals or stigmatizing populations that we are trying to investigate and help through our policies. But also part of it is the type of theory and considerations we bring onto the data to make sense of it. So that's what I would kind of put it in those two buckets.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks. Just to add to what Umit said, I think what we need to do to avoid discrimination and stereotypes is to employ what Clifford Geertz used to call thick descriptions. So rather than look at differences in employment rates, for example, at a single point in time, what would be more useful and more helpful in understanding the process is to use these longitudinal, a lot of the administrative files, and look at when marginalization, discrimination started to occur. So when was there a divergence? And it's such that comparing employment rates at a single point in time is actually an outcome. And it's an outcome of that process. And understanding that whole process will allow us to deepen our understanding of how groups came to be different and how a hierarchy emerged in Canada.
Very good. Rupa?
Yeah, I was just going to, kind of, I guess, echo what Umit said, but add that this is where it becomes extremely important that training and, mentorship of new scholars and new academics is crucial, right? To understand how to use the data, to understand the ways in which researchers' biases play into our data analysis is also very key. So it's not just a matter of having this data, having it freely accessible. Understanding the nuances of how to actually recognize your positionality and the ways in which your positionality as a researcher plays into the data analysis and the kind of implications you come up with is also just as key. So just as Abdi mentioned that it's very important for the next generation to be trained in data analysis, and the RDC is actually facilitating that in providing data, it's also key to include these kinds of issues in the training that we provide to the next generation.
Thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Susan McDaniel to Rupa and Abdi, relevant to the questions of international comparisons. Even DLI data is not available to researchers outside Canada. I'm wondering if panelists might comment more broadly on this. So DLI is Data Liberation Initiative, DLI data. Rupa or Abdi and/or?
Yes, first of all, hi Susan, that's good to see your name here, hear your name here. I think that falls within the discussion that we had earlier about the internationalization of research and the ability to do internationally comparative research. I'm reminded of a phrase that I think Martin Lipset has mentioned in one of his books, comparing Canada and US. And I think there is a lot of truth in that anyone who knows only one society knows no society. So I think the international, the comparative research and the ability to compare different experiences in different countries, as Mike mentioned, will allow us to understand what is happening here, and will allow them to understand what is happening in their country. So I think this is the must in terms of the future direction of data analysis.
Thank you very much. Also, now have a final question just before we stop. So it's a question to all panelists. So, and it's an easy and difficult one at the same time. So how has COVID-19 exposed the need for more robust data on ethnic, racial differences in health risk and outcomes? Let's start with Michael.
What I think it's underscored is the need for a rapid response data infrastructure. I'm not sure what else to call it. I've been doing a little bit of COVID researchers with some of my colleagues here at Western, and one of the things that we discovered very early is that it's difficult. You're often required to look at aggregated data and essentially knowingly commit ecological fallacies, because all we have is information at the neighborhood level and infections at the neighborhood level. We don't necessarily know if these people, if these things connect to one another. So I think one of the things that it underscores is how we have to work collectively and together to try to get data in the hands of researchers more quickly.
Thank you. I like this rapid response tagline. Umit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly if any one of us can say something brand new here to bring light to this question, but question is a very important one. At the very beginning, I mean, I kind of try to remember last, 7, 8 months. At the beginning, there wasn't much of an awareness. Like, you may remember people were talking about COVID being a kind of a leveler. Everybody thought, well, COVID, some kind of illness is going to touch everybody. We are all in it. We're in the same boat. That was the first reaction. Think back. And then immediately it started becoming really very visible and clear that actually it's not really leveling anything, it's actually revealing something. And what was being revealed is that certain populations were being touched by this condition much worse than others. And those populations were those people who were working in precarious work, those people who had certain work conditions that exposed them more intensively to the virus than others. And the moment that started happening, when we started looking at it, we started seeing, not necessarily from Canada, the data was more coming from US and other places. All of a sudden, it was more blacks that were being touched. And New York City data, remember back in April, May, all of a sudden you had black communities suffering. And then you started looking at the death data. And then again, you started seeing. So I guess what happened is that COVID brought to our attention, I mean, something that some people knew for a long time, and some perhaps just woke up to the reality that actually the society and socioeconomic conditions, even if an illness comes and looks like everybody's going to get it, well, first of all, not everybody gets it. And second of all, even if you get it, if you leave age aside for a second, there are certain conditions, health conditions, underlying conditions that are actually socioeconomically based, that are actually making those populations get impacted and more severely than others. So going back to now, that's the kind of a policy analysis answer. So going back to data, COVID said, collect disaggregated data so that we understand, just like my academic colleagues said, so that we understand better who's getting impacted and who's not. And at the very beginning, there wasn't such data. That's why I was kind of in my little presentation trying to kind of, promote and advertise the work that we did with Ontario, ICES, and their analysis just came out a few weeks ago. They were able, looking at the linked data, they were able to tell exactly and precisely which immigrant communities, what type of categories and from what source countries and gender and everything else, full intersectionality, were being impacted by COVID compared to other non-immigrant. So I think there are lots of lessons probably for all of us, and I am very glad to see also Jane's question at the beginning that StatsCan and other jurisdictions, and we need the provinces. I underline here, provinces, they have very important data. It's not StatsCan who has all the data or federal departments. We need the provinces, we need this collaboration, truly sitting at a table, and I heard that there is such a table, Abdi was saying, and to look at that for Canada at large, to as they say, unlock the value of data to serve for better policies to serve Canadians at large.
Thank you. Very passionate answer to a difficult question. We'll move on to Abdi. Oh, Rupa. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that jumps out at me is the lag in time that it takes to actually get access to data. There were some really innovative data collection methodologies that came out, like crowdsourcing data and things like that, that were introduced in response to COVID to try and get more disaggregated data. So I think that was, you know, innovative and effective, but based on the data that we had access to in the RDCs, or even through data liberation, we wouldn't be able to tell anything from in terms of what was going on the ground, because it's just so delayed. So I think this these innovative ideas for collecting data quickly are absolutely key in this regard. So.
Thank you. And Abdi, you have the last word.
I put some pressure on me. I think what Amit so eloquently and passionately mentioned is the answer to this. I would, for me, I think the COVID situation or any other challenge that we might face in the future will, of course, bring about some specifics related to that particular problem. But it will highlight, as I think the COVID situation has highlighted, the importance of learning about the existing and the persistent inequalities that are out there. And these are the things that are at work at the moment as well.
Thank you. So what we need in summary is sharing data across jurisdictions, rapid response channel, more timeliness, and also bring it all together so that it helps us move forward as a nation, of course, to you know, support Canadians during this time. So thank you very much, everyone, panelists. Thank you for your time, your wisdom. It was your passion for this data, and it was an interesting panel for sure. And thank you, everyone who participated online. We invite you to attend our session tomorrow at the same time, 1 p.m., and it will be about poverty, homelessness, and housing. And on that, I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you.